Welcome to WitchLit, a place to talk about the craft of writing and writing the craft. I'm your host, Victoria Raschke, author, publisher, witch, and nosy Scorpio. Karl Sigler was born and raised in Wilmington, Delaware, but set roots in Atlanta, Georgia, where he lives with his wife, cat, and a three-legged dog. He studied literature and semiotics at New York University, which did not prepare him for a career as a professional computer hacker. Karl writes weird horror under the pseudonym K. Ungeheuer and recently published a collection of flash fiction under the title The Cockroach of the Dada Movement, The Life and Selected Works of K. Ungeheuer, 1908 to 1988. Karl Sigler, welcome to WitchLit.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am so excited this finally worked out that we could get you on. And as the usual disclaimer, Karl and I know each other. So if this interview sounds a little different, you'll know why. But you and I haven't talked about this, so I am excited to talk about this. Our first question for everybody is why write?
Oh, I'm not sure that I could exist without writing. I've been writing for so long, it just feels like breathing. It's something that I've always gravitated to. Really early on, I think I had a teacher and my parents were very encouraging of my creative work. And it's always been a part of my life since. Writing is extremely important to me, just to get out specific emotions, really engage with myself, and really write things that I like to read myself. When you're creating things that you feel proud of in the end and you feel like you're contributing to, this creative ecosystem, I like to be a part of that.
Yeah. So what was the journey from kind of writing for yourself to writing a published book? What did that look like for you?
It was difficult. I was a literature semiotics major in college, and I had severe ADHD and dyslexia, which made reading and writing extremely difficult. So I got really, really good at sort of skimming, getting the gist of things, filling in the blanks. Mm-hmm. And that really carried over to my reading and my writing. A lot of the things that I like to read in the past are really short stories, small snippets. The Franz Kafka, one of my favorite writers, when I saw that you could just write a little paragraph and that would be a whole story, it blew my mind. Mm-hmm. Then the short stories of Jorge Luis Borges, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I really gravitated towards those weird, occasionally horrific, short pieces. And that's what I would write. It's what I could really wrap my head around. It was a difficult process. When I originally started writing the Ungeheuer stories, they were short little pieces of flash fiction. I really didn't think anybody would want to read them. So I started collecting them all on one single place. And then to stitch them together, I created a backstory of a fake author to sort of wrap the whole thing up. Mm-hmm. And that sort of helped me a lot to work on some larger piece in small little chunks, which is how I could digest it. Yeah.
Do you think there was, I don't know, I think about like creating this persona of Ungeheuer do you think that was a way to kind of make it easier to put that stuff out there, to have like this little bit of a storefront to hide behind?
Absolutely. It's a pen name that I've had for a very long time. I never even considered writing anything under my own name. Everything I was going to write was going to be an Ungeheuer specific piece. That's changed. I'm writing stuff under my own name now. But having that persona, I think not only sort of separated the work from myself, but it gave it an entirely different context. When you're reading these short pieces by some lit student from NYU, born in 1970, you're going to have an entirely different impression of the work than if you think it actually came from a surrealist who was born in the 1920s. So I think it brought an entirely different flavor to the work. And I think it attracted readers that I would have never gotten if I published under my own name.
Yeah. I do. One of the for folks who haven't read it, one of the threads through the book is commentary on the pieces that give you the kind of outline of Ungeheuer's life. And it's just fascinating. Like, it really reads like, here's this kind of biographic piece following this gentleman's writing. Yeah, I mean, I think if you didn't have the zinger at the end to let people know, it's like, oh yeah, this could totally be a real dude.
And that was also sort of my intent. I really enjoy literary hoaxes. I write about them a lot. All the stories, Jonathan Swift, this is an absolutely true story. Robinson Crusoe was also presented as if it was a memoir and a true story. Those sorts of things that I just have always been drawn to. It's just like when you watch a horror movie and you see it based on a true story come up front, like, oh, okay, I'm invested. I'm going to see what this is all about. And especially when I find out that it's not true, I was really going for that angle. And in the early days when I first put the website up, I was getting a lot of that specific type of attention. When the New York Public Library's website was first put up, they had a list of authors' resources. And Kay Ungeheuer was listed right between Mark Twain and Jules Verne.
Oh, wow.
as an author.
That's going to make you feel pretty good that you've succeeded in your literary hoax.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. Then there's a woman who narrated one of the stories for her podcast early on. And I had to let her know that, Ungeheuer doesn't really exist. So eventually I wrote a whole essay that I had on the website so I could direct people to the hoax. And Ungeheuer himself really wasn't as important as the writing at one point. I started getting more focused on the writing than I did at focusing on Ungeheuer the man.
Yeah. And when I first got the book, I think I told you this, that I just kind of dipped in. I didn't read it cover to cover. I would just pick it up and pick a page and read, and found it really interesting. I too am a lover of flash fiction. Though I write novels, for a little while with a group of writer friends, we had a flash fiction Friday thing, and we would get a prompt and we'd have to post it by Monday, from this prompt we got. And I love the idea of having to tell a whole story, in this snapshot of a photo, almost like taking a photograph. And I really think, and I think it shows in your book, and I think it shows in a lot of other flash fiction work, there's something about the surreal and horror that works in that format, I think, better than almost any other genres in that short format, because then your human brain kicks in and extrapolates from there. So
absolutely. In fact, I had a quote from Ungeheuer at one point that the whole point is to just grab a small little chunk of a larger story and let the reader fill in what came before and what came after that specific moment. And that type of leaving it to the reader's imagination works so well with weird horror in general and anything surrealistic, because you can just set something out there that will make people say, what? Yeah. And then they just try to answer that question themselves because there's no other information that they can rely on.
And often they will scare themselves more than you could have anyway.
100%.
What is it that I think Stephen King talks about, when you kind of how he writes is when there's something horrible in the hole, you describe everything around the hole, like the texture of the grass and the color of the sky and the smell of the air. And then you just let them imagine what's in that hole. It'll be the thing that scares them the most.
Yep. And I love Stephen King. I love his work. I really cut my teeth on it when I was a kid. My uncle was also really into Stephen King. And whenever a new King book came out, I'll be home from school and the hardback would be sitting there on the table waiting for me.
Yeah. My family were all big Stephen King and Straub readers. And I probably read some of those when I was a little too young to read them, quite honestly.
Oh, same. Stephen King's short story, The Jaunt, about teleportation, haunts me to this day.
Yeah.
The line, longer than you think, Daddy, will pop into my head. I'm like, ugh. horrifying.
Yeah, I think weirdly the one that sticks with me, and maybe because I'm a writer, is the Typewriter of the Gods.
Yeah.
Because it's a little bit unlike his other stuff, because there is like almost a ironic humor to it, but also kind of the horror of like you create these worlds and then you're the master, the god of them.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's like
fantastic.
Yeah. So one of the things I noticed about the different pieces, and I don't want to give like spoilers, although I guess, it's hard to spoil a tiny story, but I feel like there's two themes. Like there's a body horror theme that kind of runs through, which I think is very true of Dadaism and surreal movements, is there were a lot of like, kind of looking at the body of this, they're just placed in the body and kind of the weirdness of being human. I mean, I think those are very true to those movements. There's also a lot about like Greek and Roman gods. There's a lot of mythology and stuff in there. So you want kind of, I guess, maybe talk about those threads in the work?
Yeah, absolutely. So body horror has always been a favorite of mine. Again, for a large chunk of my life, I was more heavily influenced by movies than I was other authors. It was just easier to consume. So David Cronenberg was one of my favorite directors of all time, the godfather of body horror. And then in books that I read that I loved, there's a lot of just like visceral, gory descriptions that I fell in love with that sort of thing. The idea that your body can turn against you in one way or another, or that your body is being used to harm you or torture you or is out of your control. I think those are the most frightening things out there. So I definitely love to talk about that a bit. And then mythology, again, the whole short story concept and being able to just grab little chunks. I devoured mythology as a child, especially growing up in a household that was really into New Age occult in the 70s. My parents were Age of Aquarius hippies. I had access to mythologies from everywhere. And I would buy those books up and I could consume them. So those myths have always been very influential. I love the idea of something so unimaginable and large, that sort of Lovecraftian cosmic horror. I try and pull that in as well. So I love the myths, still love the myths. It's just phenomenal.
Yeah. So obviously, because of the theme of the podcast, I kind of want to dig into your occult 70s childhood.
Sure.
Because I think, a lot of folks who come to, either be occult practitioners or cult writers now who are our age, around, Gen X, probably did not grow up like that. A lot of us grew up in either kind of non-religious or vaguely Christian or very Christian households. So I'm just curious, like, how you feel like that influenced your writing early on, how, I guess the threads that continue on into your writing now.
Yeah. Oh, it was massively influential. My father was not religious, but very spiritual. And my mother is both spiritual and religious. So as my sister and I were growing up, they were really adamant about exposing us to every possible religion they could, and letting us decide for ourselves. My father and mother pretty much grew up with the philosophy that all religions are more or less the same. What you're doing is trying to interpret something that is almost uninterpretable. So different people are going to interpret it in different ways, and they wanted my sister and I to interpret it in our own way. But they were heavily involved in the 70s New Age occult. And that was so much fun as a kid. When you get to go shopping with your mother and you come home with 2 new tarot decks, you feel powerful when you're like 9 years old and you think you can like tell the future or control things outside. I loved everything about it. And eventually, I was following in their footsteps very closely. I really gravitated towards Norse mythology and Norse Wicca, which unfortunately has been so just tainted and poisoned these days by just hateful, harmful people. And that was pretty much all my teens. I fully believed it. It was part of who I was. It was part of my identity. And pretty much until I started to go to college, and it sort of fell off. I think that a lot of people end up rebelling against their parents in one way or another. And my parents really thought that by exposing me to all religions, I would find the one that worked for me. And I ended up becoming an atheist, which is probably the worst thing I could possibly be. My mother still refuses to hear it. But it's great. Both my parents were extremely loving. I grew up in a very loving, encouraging, supportive household, which is a rarity. Not many people can say that. So I'm extremely lucky in that regard.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know a lot of atheist witches. So do you still have like elements that you from like occult or Wicca or anything that you hang on to that don't have a theist bent to them, I guess?
Yeah, I think that it really taught me a respect for nature, a respect for the physical world around me. I love the pagan statement that, I worship nature. I can prove it exists. And a lot of that sticks with me, sure. And it definitely influences my writing. There's a lot of ritual in my writing. A piece that I sold for a anthology in Australia was one of the first things that I published under my own name. And it was all about this ritual that was taking place in a old temple, and the massive cult outside and another cult that was trying to stop them. Very Pulp Fiction, very bloody, very gory. But just those rituals, the having that background really lets me write those scenes. I feel like I can speak to that. So it's still heavily influential on my work.
Yeah. So you have rituals in your writing. Do you have rituals around your writing? Like what is your writing day look like for you? Like when you get to have Karl's ideal writing day, what does that look like?
Probably my biggest ritual around writing is just going to the pub. I love just going to the local pub, sitting down and opening up my laptop, having a beer or two and maybe some fries. And it puts me in the mood to write. I don't really like socializing. I'm a very introverted person. So just sitting at the very end of the bar, having my laptop open, pounding away, and just listening to all the conversations around me. You get the young couple that's getting into their first fight at the end of the bar. You get the family with the screaming kids behind you, the mother that's late getting to dinner because she had to work longer. All those little conversations, I just absorb them. And I think it helps my writing. It helps me with my dialogue. Absolutely. Fleshing out characters. So many of my characters were just based on some random person that was just sitting at the bar that day and just had a specific lilt to their voice or a way of carrying themselves that I just wanted to include. But generally it's still very difficult. We talked about Stephen King earlier, and he very heavily influences my work. His book on writing is something that I go back to quite a bit. And there's one little part in there where he's talking about different writers' writing habits. And he talks about the famous anecdote about James Joyce, where James Joyce's friend comes back to their apartment, and Joyce is just on the bed crying, just completely beyond himself. And his friend's like, James, what's wrong? He's like, I wrote 7 words today. And he's like, James, 7 words. That's fantastic for you. You actually wrote 7 words in one day? It's like, yeah, but I don't know what order they go in. And that is closer to my writing process. If I write a sentence or two, I'm really happy about it. If I can get couple of hundred words written over the course of a weekend, ecstatic. But there's some weeks I'll go a week or two without writing anything at all. It just depends on when the mood hits me. And whenever I've tried to force myself to have a writing time, force myself to be in a specific place to do writing, it just completely freezes me up. So I have to let it hit me and write when it comes to me. It definitely doesn't make things fast. But eventually I get things done.
Yeah, I know. I've talked with other folks on the show and just writers I know. And I think, when you're, especially if you do creative writing in college, or if you kind of come up in a workshop kind of things like, oh, writers write every day. You do, this is a job, you do blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, for some people that doesn't work. I mean, and I think it kind of sets you up for failure if that's not how you work. Is you think, oh, I'm not legitimate because I don't do this thing that I'm supposed to be doing to be a real writer. I
quit writing several times because of that very thing. I thought that if you're going to be a writer, you have to do it this way. And I couldn't. And so I would stop writing for years sometimes and try and do music or painting or animation. I was really big into animation for a little while just to still create something. But I always came back to writing. And when I realized how I write and how I create, I think that's one of the hardest lessons for any author to learn, because every author is unique. Every author is going to have their own process, and finding what works for you is really the first step to writing things that you believe in and you like.
I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, I'm always fascinated by people's writing habits and what they do, but kind of like an anthropological thing, not like, oh, I should do this. And I think maybe that's the way we should approach it, rather than this is how writers write, and you must do it this way to call yourself a writer. That's garbage and unhelpful. So when you got those stories together, I too write slow, so I empathize with that. I'm a slow writer. But so I know it can take a long time to kind of get to like the groundswell of this is ready to maybe go out into the world. So how did you decide what you were going to do with this material and how you were going to publish?
That was interesting, because these stories have been really put together over the course of 30 years, probably. I would write in sort of bursts. I wrote a big chunk of them in the 90s for the website specifically. I moved here to Atlanta, and that sort of fell off. And then after getting settled in Atlanta, I wrote a little bit more, pushed it out to the website. And it's only been in the past, maybe just before the pandemic hit, where I've really gotten back into my writing, and I started just cranking out new Ungeheuer stories left and right. And around that same time, KDP was coming up, and I was realizing that early on, I was expecting that, all literature is going to be on the web, right? In the early days of the internet, everybody is just going to be going to websites rather than reading books. And luckily, that's never really happened. And I do all of my reading, on my Kindle or my hardbacks and paperbacks when I want a permanent copy. And I realized that is sort of the trend. And I started thinking about, for the first time, putting all the stories together and actually publishing a paper book. And it was a weird concept for me, honestly. But once I wrapped my head around it, it just became familiar. The whole process of putting together like an introduction and all the formatting concepts and making sure there's a good flow to the overall stories, kind of shuffling them up. I really enjoyed the process. I fell in love with it. And it just started to work. I was afraid I wouldn't have enough of them to actually put together. I expected it to be like a 30-page book. And as I started putting it together, I'm like, wow, I have a lot more than I thought I did. And if I flesh out this section and I add this section in here, this could actually be something. So it was a different part of the process, but a really exciting one.
I think as a reader coming to it, it would be surprising to find out that they were over that much of a period, because they seem like a very coherent work. So
Thank you. I think they do have a very specific voice to them. When I write Ungeheuer stories, I have a different mindset than some of my other stories. The failure of Godier's Gate, the ritual one I was talking about earlier for that Australian anthology, it does not fit Ungeheuer's style at all, which is why I published it under my own name. And that freed me up a lot, because when I'm writing Ungeheuer, I think like Ungeheuer, and those are the stories I write. When I realized I could write as myself, that opened up a whole new world of things where I wasn't necessarily pigeonholed into that Ungeheuer mindset. So I definitely have a voice that I try to emulate when I write those stories. So I'm happy to hear that works in a sense.
Yeah, I love this idea of like writing as two people. I'm more than just like the idea of like, oh, this is my pen name. Like this is actually a whole persona of a person rather than. So now that you write as both, like, do you have preference?
Yeah, I do. I think Ungeheuer is probably done for now. I'm writing different things than I wrote as Ungeheuer. And then, like, when I was writing an Ungeheuer, I would really get into that Dada surrealist mindset. And now writing as myself and sort of freeing myself from that box, I have a lot more freedom, a lot more leverage to do what I want to do. So I'm working on longer pieces. I'm working on pieces that wouldn't necessarily fit Ungeheuer directly. And it feels like progress. It feels like I'm moving forward with this. So right now, I really enjoy writing as Karl Sigler.
Well, good. That's exciting.
It is.
We talked a little bit about, kind of how we come to being writers and what we think writers are supposed to do. Do you feel like there's like especially good advice or especially bad advice you've been given as a writer?
Ooh, that's a good one. Especially good advice, really, probably the Stephen King anecdote I just mentioned, which made me realize it was okay to write slowly. And then anything that comes out of the mouth of David Lynch. He's just one of the most motivational people from a creative standpoint, and the idea of being at rest and, diving deep to get the big fish are things that I still rely on when I'm writing. As soon as I put my fingers on the keyboard, that's coming into my head. Bad advice, probably that same good-hearted, good motive uncle who really thought that if I wasn't writing tight genre fiction, I shouldn't be writing at all. Like I should stick with horror or go science fiction. He was a big sci-fi guy as well. And I would show him my stories, which really don't fit those categories at all. And he was like, this is good, but you should probably like add a horrifying clown in or something that just would not fit at all. So yeah, that was very discouraging in the early days.
I do think about genre a lot. Like I think most people who read more widely. I mean, they obviously have an interest in the genre they write, but they tend to read a lot, nonfiction, fiction, everything around that. And so I always feel like the genre is for the label on the shelf. It's not for me when I'm writing. Like I'll figure out what that label is afterwards, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes the stories I want to tell, maybe it's really hard to put a label on it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about the weird lit category, which is occasionally also called weird horror. And it was kind of a gray space and even internal to self-identifying authors and work of, quote, weird lits. It's just a wide spectrum of different things that are going on. And I agree. I try not to think in any of those terms. I just kind of get a random idea in my head and I just keep on expanding on it. Usually it's just maybe just a single scene. Maybe it's the name of a character. The story I'm working on now was about a giant finger that just appeared out of the sky pointing at a house. And And that was just the idea that popped into my head. And it's very kind of like Monty Python, God pointing his finger down. And then I started fleshing that out. The little girl who lives there and how she grows up with this finger pointing at her house. And, you know, I try and start off with just an idea, and then I just see where the story goes. And at the end of it, maybe it's going to fit a genre, maybe it won't, but the story is what it's going to be. It pretty much, I'm just sort of a vessel carrying the story out. A lot of times I don't even know where it's going.
Yeah. I know. I think about that too. Like, I have jokingly described sometimes writing as channeling, because like I don't necessarily know where it's coming from. Like, it's obviously me somewhere, but you know, sometimes these people just feel like they're already real and you're just telling their story.
Absolutely. And I love that. And that also goes back to a lot of surrealism, right? The concepts of automatic writing, the exquisite corpse, where things kind of happen by accident or forced accidents. And then something bigger comes out of that because there wasn't really any explicit thought process. I think a lot of times at least when I'm writing, it does feel like channeling to a certain extent. It's just kind of flowing out, and I'm not really thinking about it until after it's on the paper. I'm like, oh, I don't know where that came from, but all right, I like that.
I like that, yeah. Or my favorite is when I have a character who I think has a purpose in the story, and then it turns out that their purpose is completely other than what I anticipated.
I've killed so many characters, and not like as part of the plot or story, but just realizing that this character is completely superfluous. It's not really doing anything here, and I like them. So I have a whole slush box of stuff that I cut out of stories that I can go back to and see if they fit in different stories. So I'm hoping the brother of the one character in this other story I'm writing, didn't work out at all. But I think he's going to have a place in the next story idea that I'm working on.
Yeah, that's right. When because I'm working on a novel, and I always have like a second document behind it where I, like, if I excise something, it's like I don't want to throw it away, so I just put it in this other document, which becomes kind of weird to read over the course of writing the novel. But I always feel like you just don't know, there might be gold in there somewhere. Don't throw it away. So
absolutely.
So what like now, like if Ungeheuer is kind of done for now, at least, like what do you hope readers get from this book now, and kind of how would you want them to kind of shift to reading your work, I guess? So it's like, what do you hope your audience takes away from those stories, and what is that different than what you want them to take away from the stuff writing under your name?
That's good. That's a good question. I think that one of my goals writing the Ungeheuer stories was just to keep the world a little bit weird. You know, I love reading things that are really odd, weird, bizarre, and I don't feel like there's enough of that around right now. So again, I'm trying to write things that I would want to read. You know, the Gabriel Garcia Marquez stories, like The Man with the Enormous Wings, was just so influential on me. You know, just this potential angel, or maybe just a man with wings, shows up on a beach and becomes just a local sideshow attraction, and just odd. That's just so weird. I love everything about that. And you just don't see stories like that these days. So Ungeheuer is my attempt to just add a little dash of weird into people's day. I think reading the Ungeheuer stories the way you did, just most of them are only 2 or 3 paragraphs tops. They might not even fill a full page, and there's not necessarily an overall arc. So opening it to a random page and just reading what's there is exactly how I would recommend that. My newer stuff, I think, is very similar. You know, I still have that goal of adding something weird to the world. I love that stuff. So I think that the work I'm doing now is a little bit more complex, a little bit more fleshed out. It's longer, right? I mean, there's the actual plot, there's actual characters that are interacting with each other for a long period of time. So I'm hoping that it's going to be something that you can really dive into a little bit deeper than you can with the Ungeheuer stories, because it is just flash fiction. And maybe provides a little bit of a richer, weird experience for people. So I see it as sort of a next step, a growth of what Ungeheuer's original voice was, with the freedom to not necessarily be tied to that persona.
Yeah. Great. So I sent you questions, so we have a game of chance at the end for your last question. But before we get to that, do you want to talk about what you have coming up and let people know how to get your book or get in touch with you or follow you on all the socials or whatever?
All the socials. So my the work that I'm currently working on, it's barely in first draft mode. It's going to be a while before I get that out. When I do, I'll definitely be posting it on my Ungeheuer socials. So I still use Ungeheuer as my primary author's profile. So on Twitter, that's at k.ungeheuer. No, just k.ungeheuer. Instagram, the same. It's going to be at k.ungeheuer across all the platforms. Mm-hmm. You can also go to the website directly. It's cockroach.org, just like the bug. And that grew over time too, right? So Ungeheuer, originally I registered the domain cockroach.org back in the early 90s, where you could still get a domain that was that clear and obvious. But then I had to tie cockroach in with Ungeheuer somehow, because I liked the domain. And originally it was spiritual cockroaches. That became cockroach engenderment, where each story he was writing was a little cockroach that he was creating. And finally, the most recent incarnation is part of his backstory, where he was just a kid tagging along with all these Dadaists and Surrealists in Berlin. And they nicknamed him the Little Cockroach because he was always around. So much better than the other two. So much better.
And kind of fluid. I mean, like, it just slides into the book and you're like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. Yep. So,
and that was a relatively new incarnation too. When I was going through and revisiting all the old work and rewriting it for the publication. So yeah, cockroach.org. You can go directly there. You'll see how to contact me. You'll also see all the links to all my socials as well. And you can also email me. Pretty much anything at cockroach.org will get to my inbox. So k.ungeheuer at cockroach.org is typically what I give out to people.
Great. And we'll have all those links and stuff in the show notes so people can find those pretty easily, since, sometimes listening does not translate to remembering those things. So
how do you spell Ungeheuer?
Yeah, Ungeheuer is before I started recording, Carl, I was telling Carl I've been studying German as kind of my pandemic project, and it was fun to dip into the book and go, oh, I don't have to go look these up. And Ungeheuer is like monstrosity, right? Like that's kind of the translation.
So back in the early 90s, I was hanging out at a tattoo shop quite a bit. I was just a regular there, and the tattoo artist was named Karl with a C. I'm Karl with a K. So to not mix us up, he was just Karl and I just went as K. So people just call me K. And things got a little bit crazy at the tattoo shop. There's a lot of drinking going on. And eventually I got nicknamed K Monster in the tattoo shop. Then, I'm German. I took German. I love German. Monster became Ungeheuer, and K Ungeheuer became that new persona.
There you go. We also, being German family, we have a lot of Karls with K in my family too. So
the only way to spell it. What's a C?
What's a C? Yeah. All right. So for our last question, I'm going to roll the little die. This lovely polyhedral set, a D&D set. And depending on what number I get, you get a question about death, sex, religion, politics, or money.
Ooh, okay.
It's kind of related either to your work or writing in general. I try not to just like blindside people. And if I roll a 6, you get to pick which one you want.
Oh, okay.
So, and there are pretty much no other rules.
Oh, okay.
So, for politics. Which is a discussion you and I have had a lot about, not on this interview, but in general. Yeah. So do you think that writers have political obligations? And if they do, what would those be?
It's a great question. I think everybody has political obligations in some form or fashion. Period. We live in a society. We're in a society to support one another, and I think that writing and art in general can't help be political in some form or fashion. Generally speaking, I know it affects my work quite a bit. I look back at that age that I love, the Dadaists and Surrealists in Berlin in the 20s, and how quickly that just completely changed from these beautiful, weird, crazy artists and people to Hitler's brown shirts walking through, and the fascism that really capitalized on calling these people decadent and perverse. And, seems like a lot of the same stuff's going around these days too. I also write horror. Politics right now is kind of horrific. So I think that everybody really has an obligation to be political in some form or fashion. A decision to not be political is still a decision. And I think artists in general can't help but have it reflect in their work in some form or fashion. A lot of my work is about power struggles. A lot of my work is about people that are maybe oppressed in some form or fashion, or experiencing a really horrible situation and how to deal with it. And I think that that type of writing gives people exposure to those emotions before they have to deal with it in a real world. Mm-hmm. And again, I think that ties in with politics directly, especially when so many population of people are under threat right now, like literal physical threat. I think absolutely.
Yeah. Me too. Obviously, I probably wouldn't have asked that question. But it's funny you bring up the Dadaists and the Surrealists, because I was thinking about that before we talked. I just kind of did a little refresher because it's been a hot minute since I'd read up on Dadaism Surrealism, and was reminded that, they became decadent and perverse to the Nazis, but they were also a reaction to nationalism before that. So, I mean, it was kind of this, making ridiculousness of this whole move to like, the fatherland kind of stuff that was going on even before Hitler. Yep. I don't, is there any like very large artistic movement in Western history? I mean, I don't know as much about art outside of the Western tradition that isn't kind of a political reaction either to what's going on or the art that came before it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you see that all over. I just found an old 15th century illustration that was basically a political propaganda about Catholics. It was the Catholic Protestant debates, and even then, there's these pieces of art that speak directly to the political situation at the time. Mm-hmm. And I think we see that back and forth, that cat and mouse game throughout history, throughout cultures, every continent. I think that you can follow art trends and literary trends, music trends in any cultural timeline, and it will mirror a lot of what's going on politically in those areas and at that time. And I think it's part of that record, right? It's part of a better understanding of the context of the time by seeing what art was being created then too. So we have an important place in history, and I think it's important to respect that.
Mm-hmm. I'm always surprised when, the thing I can think of right now is when certain people on the right are surprised that bands like Rage Against the Machine are political and are like, just shut up and sing. And I'm like, did you really listen at any point before now? Like, just this idea that somehow now the artist should not be political, like just do the thing or just play basketball or just, don't have a political voice in the society that you also live in.
Right.
This doesn't make any sense to me as a human or a writer that suddenly like, oh, well, you're just a artist or a creator. You shouldn't have a political say. And I'm like, who do they round up first?
Right. Yep. Exactly. And you see it in the horror movie community as well, right? With Jordan Peele being, too woke. He's embedding politics in his movies way too much, and that just turns me off. And when has horror not been political? You go back to Night of the Living Dead. I mean, that was about police brutality. It was about the Vietnam War. It was about so much that was going on at that specific point in time.
Yeah.
The Exorcist, Omen, all of these movies. I mean, throughout history, they've been always making a political statement. And the fact that there's so many people that somehow want entertainment that is, or whatever, some sort of piece of artwork that is devoid of that, is sterilized from that, is I just don't understand it at all. It does not make any sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, any creative endeavor is contextualized by the culture the person's living in. I mean, that's just kind of how being a human works.
Right. Yep.
So yeah, it's a strange phenomenon to me that like, just shut up and do whatever I want you to do. Take my money and don't try and tell me anything. And I'm like, yeah, that's not how that works.
No. And go elsewhere then, because I'm not going to do that.
Yeah. And I think the flip side of it that I find interesting is, I've been to writers' conferences and people will say on panels or like in conversations, well, I just don't say anything political publicly because I don't want it to hurt my sales. And I'm like, wow, I don't want them buying my book if they're a fascist. Sorry.
Right. And if you're not willing to be open about, your politics because of your sales, I'm not sure I want to read that book either.
Yeah, it's like, there's no way that my politics aren't in my work. So if they disagree with them so vehemently, they're not going to enjoy my work. Yeah. I don't think. Or they're not going to see it for what I think it is.
And I think there's also a stigma, especially in literature, where especially fiction that is written with some political message, a lot of times can be really clumsy, right? Which isn't necessarily because of the mentioning of anything political, but just because they don't know how to convey that message in a very fluid way. And it can seem really chunky and clumsy and, not really worth the read. So I can see where some of that criticism comes from. But then you look at, historical writers, Voltaire and, oh my God, I'm totally blanking on Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift.
It happens.
Yeah. And then even today, China Miéville, who's a open communist in the UK, and it's really reflected in his weird works, and in a very, very excellent way, because his work is truly amazing. I wish he'd get back to fiction, but I understand what he's doing, and I appreciate him for it. I think that it can be done right. And when it is done right, I don't think there's anything more important.
Yeah. Yeah. I had an acquaintance who I'm a big Billy Bragg fan.
Love Billy.
And I have an acquaintance who was a fan, and I mentioned something about going to a show, and she was like, I love his music, but I just can't stand to listen to him talk about politics. And I just don't want to see him live because of that. I'm just over it. And I'm like, this is not a visual medium, but if you could listeners, if you could see me, like my face is like, what? Excuse me. Like, I would pay extra to hear Billy Bragg talk. In fact, I have just gone to hear him talk and not do songs. Right. So,
yeah. I mean, have you listened to his lyrics at all?
Yeah, it was an eye opener about like, I have to say that was one of the first times in my life I was just like, oh, people can listen to this or read something or see me and just clearly not get what's going on.
Yep.
And I was like, well, I mean, the music is good and he writes great love songs, but he's also a very political person. Like that's who he is. Mm-hmm. And it's in the music too. And I was just shocked and surprised. So
that's crazy. Especially for me coming from a big punk rock background, all the punk rock music was political, right? Yeah. I mean, and when you went to a Dead Kennedy show, sometimes Jello would just be up there talking about how crappy Reagan is for the entire damn show. Loved it. Loved every moment of it.
Reagan and, Thatcher like fueled punk music. In so many ways.
Yeah. There's a whole Dead Kennedy song of just a conversation between Thatcher and Reagan on a phone with them like grinding guitar in the background. Classic.
Yes. And I do it is interesting to me what's going to come out of now. Like, what is the art that comes out of what's going on now? Because it's different. I think there's, that we're past a whiff of fascism, like we're hardcore in it. And I think that's going to be interesting to see, what art comes out of that. It's hard to say that because like there's no way to live through it and be able to have this fascination about it at the same time. It's a strange dichotomy of like being I don't want to live through this just to see what comes out the other side,
Yeah, but here we are.
So
let's get to the other side.
That's right. Let's work right, whatever we need to do to get there. So
yeah.
Well, awesome. Well, Karl, thank you for being on the show. It was so great to talk writing with you. And when the next thing comes up, let's chat again.
Absolutely. I really appreciate talking to you. It's so great to see you again. We're going to have to get out to your side of the country and come visit soon.
Yeah, that sounds like a plan. I love it.
Awesome. Excellent.
WitchLit is a production of Thousand Volt Press and is edited by Kaifel Agostini. Our music is Voices by Alexander Shenekar. You can support our work at ko-fi.com/witchlitpodcast. And if you'd like to submit your own death, sex, religion, politics, or money questions, or have questions or comments about the show, you can send an email to victoria@witchlitpod.com. And please be sure to let us know if we can use your name on the show. Transcripts and all our previous episodes are available at witchlitpod.com, and you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter @witchlitpod. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and consider giving us a rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps other witches find the show. Thanks for listening and for reading witchy.